Welcome to the Kingdom Way podcast. My name is Justin Gravatt, and I hope that this will be a place where we can have meaningful conversations about the Christian faith to better help us follow Jesus, the living and reigning King. My goal is that through these theological discussions, we can better learn about the way of Jesus, which will profoundly influence how we live each and every day. The gospel of the kingdom of God, the good news Jesus preached, offers a new way of living, and that requires that we take seriously what Jesus taught and how he lived. But this work is absolutely worth it, as following and practicing this kingdom way of Jesus leads to an abundant and flourishing life as we connect learning with living. As followers of Jesus, we are told to love God with all of our heart, mind, and soul. We are warned against gaining the material world, but forfeiting our souls. And we are promised that it is God who restores our souls. But what exactly is the soul? And why think the soul exists in the first place? Helping us navigate this topic is Eric Hernandez. Eric works in evangelism and apologetics and has a heart for proclaiming the gospel and defending the Christian faith on theological and philosophical grounds. He is the apologetics lead and millennial specialist for the Baptist General Convention of Texas. He has spoken and debated publicly at numerous university college campuses where he defends the Christian faith against atheist and agnostic professors of different worldviews. He holds an associate degree in social science, a bachelor's degree in theology, and a certificate in apologetics from Biola University. Eric, thanks so much for coming on the Kingdom Way podcast.
Thank you for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Before we dive into our topic here about the soul, I know this is an area you've studied quite a bit and are really passionate about. I recently saw that you wrote a book called The Lazy Approach to Evangelism, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers. So I wonder if you could take a few minutes to kind of tell us a little bit about it.
Yeah, so not officially out just yet. We had our annual meeting for the Baptist General Convention of Texas, and we had like a preprint, so to speak, for people there. But essentially, in a nutshell, it's kind of self-explanatory as the title implies, or at least a subtitle, a simple guide for conversing with non-believers. And the phrase lazy approach kind of comes from something I had mentioned years ago in my engagements with non-believers. And it was actually Greg Kokel who helped me pick the title. So before I ever read Kokel's book on tactics, I was doing what I would call my version of tactics. After learning philosophy, my background is I started studying philosophy before I really took a deep dive into apologetics or any theology. Noticing that, when conversing with people, a lot of times they would say things that either weren't objections or arguments. And what I often find is a lot of times believers tend to get bogged down in the nitty gritty or the stuff that's non-central to the discussion. And so as a quick example, I once had a young lady tell me that she was an atheist and that she could only believe things that are backed up by logic and evidence. And I said, oh, okay, well, fantastic, me too. And so my question was, and what logic and evidence do you have for the belief there is no God? And she thought about it for a second and said, well, the Bible is full of contradictions. Now, most people at this point are going to immediately try to defend, biblical inerrancy or whatnot. But this is where what I call the lazy approach comes in. My response was to ask a question. And my question was, and how does that prove that there's no God? And she looked kind of stunned because, again, no one's asked for that. They usually start arguing with her. And so to kind of clarify, I said, let me put it this way. If God exists, would he have existed before the Bible was written? And she says, well, I don't believe in God. I said, no, I understand that. But I'm saying if he existed, would he have existed before the Bible was written? And she says, well, yeah, if he exists. I said, okay, great. So even if I concede your point that the Bible is full of, quote, contradictions, how would that prove that he doesn't exist or make him cease to exist? What am I missing here? And with just a few questions, I'm already getting her to think, planted a seed, if you will. And just, again, with a few questions within a few minutes, I'm not arguing with her. I'm not debating her. I'm taking what I call the lazy approach.
A lot of Christians maybe get a little intimidated when they think about evangelism or apologetics. So it sounds like you're removing a lot of those barriers and encouraging people to get into those conversations. And maybe we can have you on the podcast to talk about it at a later date. But today we're going to be talking about the soul. And I find it fascinating because, when you're at church in Christian songs, we'll sing about the soul. We read Bible verses which talk about human souls, God's soul. but it's not often that we actually unpack what exactly souls are. So I wonder if we could start here and ask the question, what is the soul? And then related to that, I think this follows nicely is the secondary question of, are we souls? Do we have souls? Kind of how you unpack all that.
Yeah, so great questions. Just to say up front, a lot of this gets philosophical and technical pretty quickly, but it's relatively easy to follow. So we could say that a soul we can define as an immaterial substance that contains consciousness and animates the body. So whenever I present a case for the soul, I would say there's really two basic points you need to make. The first is that consciousness is not physical, and the second is that I am more than a brain and body, namely, I am a soul. Now, in the definition, and that's already embedded in the definition, the soul is an immaterial substance that possesses consciousness. So, to understand the foundation philosophically for all this essentially comes down to the difference between what we would call in philosophy aggregates and substances. Now, to briefly break those down. So, an aggregate would be a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. So, think of things like cars, watches, or Lego bricks. These are a collection of separable parts held together in a certain structure. To illustrate the concept of why this is significant, suppose you take a tricycle, which would, by definition, at minimum be something with three wheels. Well, if you were to remove one of the wheels from a tricycle, we can say that in a metaphysical sense, metaphysical simply meaning the nature of ultimate reality. When you remove a wheel from a tricycle, we could say that a tricycle has ceased to exist. And in some sense, a bicycle has come into existence. And what that shows us is that for aggregates, they don't retain what's called identity through change, meaning they don't remain the same because their existence and identity are necessarily dependent on the parts and their structure. Now, I say all that to compare and contrast that to something like a substance. So, traditionally speaking, a substance, which is not a term that is exclusive to the physical, I believe it was Aristotle who first used that. And a substance means to stand under, to sub, like a submarine, to stand under. And a substance is a thing that stands under its properties, its characteristics. So, for example, take a dog. A dog would be the substance, and it possesses and unites the properties of being brown, of having a tail, of having two floppy ears, so on and so forth. Now, if there is no soul, I would say that you are reducible to an aggregate. You are just a collection of parts, separable parts held together in a certain structure. But then there are implications to those kind of things. So, for example, one of the arguments for the soul would be the question of whether or not we retain what's called identity through change and part replacement. So, again, as a kind of primer, take a car. If I replace the tires on a car, is it the same car? And then before answering that question, consider this. Suppose I replaced every single piece of the car, every nut, bolt, windshield, the whole nine yards. Is it the same car? But then even before answering that question, suppose I took the replaced parts and put those back together. Now we have two cars. And then the question could become, which of the two is the original, if any? Now, I think regardless of one's answer, the point would be clear that they both cannot be the original, again, if either one are. And what this shows us is, again, aggregates do not retain identity to change. So the question then becomes this. If we were to put it in a syllogism, we can say I am either a purely physical aggregate or an immaterial substance, namely a soul. Well, if I'm an aggregate, I do not maintain identity through change or part replacement. So the question is, which am I? Well, it's going to depend. Do I retain identity through change? So consider the following. We know, based on our scientific discoveries, that every 7 to 10 years, your body replaces virtually every cell in it. And let's say 7 to 10 years ago, I commit a crime, and they just now find the evidence to convict me 7 to 10 years later. Well, can they actually convict me, or could I stand up in court and say, well, wait a minute, we're just purely physical objects, and that was a different set of properties and parts 7 to 10 years ago. So the guy you're looking for is somebody else, not me, but good luck, he doesn't exist anymore. Well, of course, they're going to slap on the cuffs and put me in jail, because I think we all know that we do maintain identity through change or part replacement. Or consider an argument that a non-believer, philosopher Jaegwon Kim, that he proposed as an example of this type of argument. He said something like, in 2001, this brain and body did not exist, but I did exist in 2001. Therefore, it follows that I am not identical or reducible to this brain and body. So you can see how quickly the distinction becomes clear. And then to answer your next question, well, then the question is, well, am I a soul or do I have a soul? Well, the view that I defend is known as substance dualism. So dualism just means twoism, and a rough and ready definition of that could be that I am a soul that has a body. So note, technically speaking, I don't quote have a soul, but rather I am a soul. Now I have a body, but again, I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and a body without a soul would be nothing more than a corpse.
So going back to the original definition you gave, you said that a soul is an immaterial substance which contains consciousness and animates the body. Would that be kind of, if you could put it as succinctly as possible, would that be a accurate description?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. And then, so that fits really nicely when we're thinking about humans. Would you also say that angels and God are souls or have souls, or how would you unpack that?
Yeah, great question. So, the Bible talks about them as being spirits. So, yeah, we could say that something like God is a divine substance with, as we were talking earlier, as Craig puts it, a divine substance with three centers of consciousness or three cognitive faculties. So, yeah, we could say that if we wanted to, that God is a soul, and within that one divine substance, you have three consciousnesses.
Yeah, and a lot of this is definitely intuitive. I mean, it's complex philosophically, but I think it's commonsensical for a lot of people. I think someone might respond, let's say a Christian responds to you and says, okay, Eric, I agree with you, but this really isn't that big of a deal. Why should we, as followers of Jesus, why should we really care about this? Shouldn't we focus on other things in theology, evangelism, all that kind of stuff? So how would you respond to someone who says this just isn't really that important of a topic?
I would say, don't be so silly. Is how I would respond initially. But essentially, so this ties into even something I said earlier that if I could briefly unpack. Remember, I said that the first point I think that should be made is that consciousness is not physical. And before going into that, the application that you're asking, another one of those foundational principles for understanding this topic is what is known as Leibniz's law of the indiscernibility of identicals, which you can impress someone later with that, but we can for short say Leibniz's law of identity or Leibniz's law. And according to Leibniz's law, if two things in question are the same thing, which in philosophy we say they're identical, then whatever's true of one is going to be true of the other and vice versa. So, for example, if I say that Eric Hernandez is identical to the guest on your show, then I am saying Eric Hernandez is literally the same person as a guest on your show, which would mean that whatever's true of Eric Hernandez is going to be true of the guest on your show and vice versa. But hypothetically, if I can find something true of one that's not true of the other, again, or vice versa, then they can't be the same thing. So with this in mind, consider that Paul talks about renewing your mind. And even in Romans 7, Paul makes this distinction about, this war between his body and the inner man. He talks about, there are things I want to do that I don't do. The things that I do want to do, I end up not doing. Who can save me from this body, this flesh? Well, suffice to say that even when he talks about renewing the mind, it's important to know what it is he's getting at. And if the mind and brain are not the same thing, and here's why I say this, because if something like physicalism is true, which something like strict physicalism is the idea that there is no immaterial aspect to the human person. Everything is just physics and chemistry all the way down. Well, the first question could be asked is, are they the same thing? And on the substance dualist view, we'd say no. And using Leibniz's law of identity, this is easy to demonstrate. One being is that if my mind and brain are the same thing, then whatever's true of the mind has to be true of the brain and vice versa. But again, we know that's not the case. For example, a few quick examples. Take a state of my mind, like my thoughts or beliefs. My thoughts and beliefs can be true or false, but no region of my brain is true or false, right? It doesn't make sense to say that my neurons are firing true or my neurons are firing false. They just fire, whereas my thoughts can be true or false. A state of my brain can weigh 3 pounds, but the thought that I'm talking to you right now doesn't weigh 3 pounds. A brain can be in a state that measures 7 inches long, but the smell of a rose or the taste of a banana, which is in my mind, doesn't measure 7 inches long. And while we can go on for hours about this, the point is simply that if all the properties of the brain are physical and all the properties of the mind are not physical, well, then it would follow that if consciousness exists, it cannot be identical or reducible to the physical. So when we look at even something like Romans 7 or Paul telling us to renew our mind, what does that look like? And you'll find that he very nicely integrates our spiritual formation with our body. And this is very important. So when Paul talks about there's nothing good within me, and he clarifies that is my flesh, he's talking about sin dwelling in the members of his body. So suffice to say that sin, according to Paul here, is going to, in a real sense, dwell within your body. Think of these like habits, all right? I think it's Dallas Willard and Moreland talk about when we get into spiritual formation. You can compare that to an athlete training to, let's say, play basketball. If I want to play basketball like Michael Jordan, I can't simply will or desire to do it and then accomplish the task, right? No matter how much I want to slam dunk like Michael Jordan, I won't be able to do it unless I, at minimum, engage in certain disciplines. So I'm going to have to train my body that perhaps has bad basketball habits. And the way I do that is by renewing my mind. You even look into something like what's known as cognitive behavioral therapy or neuroplasticity. Jeffrey Schwartz, one of the leading neuroscientists engaging in research on things like OCD, anxiety, depression, suffice to say that a lot of these things, like intrusive thoughts, are kind of hardwired into a person's brain that struggles with this. And what he engages and prescribes his patients to do, and this is really interesting because he has what he calls a four-step process. And essentially what you're doing is you're challenging the thoughts that your brain produces, so to speak. So he takes a brain scan of these people prior to this experiment, and then he teaches them how to challenge their thoughts when they get certain thoughts that come into mind, how to challenge those thoughts, how to change the way they perceive these thoughts, perceive their environment. And about a month or so later, they took another brain scan of these people, and they saw that the brain, in a real sense, began to rewire itself. The chemistry of the brain began to change. And what this shows is goes back to what Paul's saying. You engage in these things by renewing your mind. Now, obviously, medication can help deal with some of these things, but as the saying goes in psychiatry, pills don't teach skills, right? So I can do certain things that are going to help. Think of it, even someone who struggles with, I don't know, something like perhaps diabetes. While insulin is certainly going to help, they're also going to have to change certain habits in their lifestyle to also help counteract what's going on in their bodies. So if the brain was nothing more, if your mind was nothing more than the brain, all we'd have to do is just change the brain. And then also the brain and mind would be the same thing. But if changing your thoughts can change your brain, then there would be some real severe or some profound implications of this, namely something like free will, that you're not causally determined to do whatever your brain does,
Hmm.
and implies some type of immaterial substance that is a first mover that can transcend the physical determinations of our body and act on the physical aspects and states of our brain. And this is where something like fasting comes into play, right? So we all need to eat to live. And essentially, fasting is a discipline that says, to personify the body, it's like saying, look, body, I know you want to eat, but you don't tell me when to eat. I tell you when to eat. And in that sense, you are really taking control of the physical determinations of your body, and you're strengthening your willpower in order to at some point change the things that you cannot currently change with the willpower that you have. So by knowing that we are something different and distinct from the body, we're able to transcend the desires of our body and take control of what our flesh desires. So another reason I'd say this is really foundationally important is the way I got into the topic of the soul was, suffice to say that freshman year of college, I had an atheist professor who essentially gave an argument against the soul. And he basically argued, well, if we're supposed to be immaterial and, the soul and the properties of your soul and the states of your mind, like thoughts, beliefs, and all that, are inside your soul, then how can an antidepressant pill or some type of drug change or affect the immaterial? Because how is it that the case that something physical has a power to affect the non-physical? And basically said, because when we look at the brain and body, we just see physical stuff, we don't see any soul. How can that be? And his answer was, well, because there is no soul, there is no body, there is no soul, there is no heaven, there is no hell. You're just a physical brain and body, and we need to live with this fact. And what troubled me was 1 Corinthians 15. Paul essentially says, if there isn't a resurrection, Christianity is false. Well, I would argue, and we can, we'll get into this later, I'm sure, that we have to understand that the resurrection is not just a physical body resurrected, but me being resurrected. And Paul, I think, hashes this out beautifully in his epistles. But if there is no soul, if there's no me, then how can there be a resurrection? If a resurrection included not just body, but me, the self, the inner man, if you will. And so suffice to say that I would argue, if there's no soul, then there can be no resurrection. And going back to Paul, within Christianity wouldn't it be true? So for the first time in my life, I hear an argument that, if true, I would say would prove Christianity false. And this was something that I had to wrestle with. And I think that's one of the most fundamental things to the existence of the soul and why this is important. because this goes into our eschatology, our view of the afterlife, our view of who we are, spiritual formation, discipleship, all these things going into whether or not the soul exists.
That reminds me a little bit of virtue ethics. Virtue ethics being the perspective that it's not so much focused on doing certain
Right.
things. Well, that's a part of it, certainly. Rather, the focus is on becoming a certain type of person
That's right.
so that
That's
certain
right.
actions become habitual. And
That's
it's
right.
almost by second nature, you do the right thing, which I think is a great ethical system and certainly fits with, for example, the Sermon on the Mount and how Jesus
Oh,
talks
absolutely.
about becoming a
Absolutely.
certain type of person.
Very good. Yeah.
Several times in the biblical narrative, we hear the authors speak of human bodies, souls, and then spirits. And this has led some Christians to affirm what is called a tripartite perspective or trichotomous perspective. And this is the view, simply put, that humans are made up of body, spirit, and soul. And then on the other side, and I know there's nuances and different perspectives within these views, but these are two of the more popular camps, is what we might call a bipartite view or a dichotomous view. And that is that there are just two parts to the human body and soul. And a helpful way, if listeners find that a little overwhelming, think of tri as three and then bi or die as two. So body, spirit, and soul, or body and soul.
So great question. So as I mentioned, I am a substance dualist, which we can just simplify by saying I am an immaterial substance, a soul, that has a body. Now, I wouldn't call the body a substance, but that goes a little bit deeper. But suffice to say, I am something immaterial and something physical. Now, I definitely believe that there's a deep integration. I believe the most natural state of a soul is to be embodied. Because sometimes people ask me, well, if you're going to go that route, how do you avoid Gnosticism? And my response is, well, by not being a Gnostic, right? Just because there's a distinction between the two doesn't mean you have to go to the extreme. But so that being said, I would hold to what you would call the dichotomous view. Again, substance dualism, twoism. Now, why not the trichotomous view? For a variety of reasons. So the soul is so I am a soul, and my soul is what contains all my capacities and faculties. What does that mean? So think of things like my faculty of mind, which it encompasses my thoughts, beliefs, sensations, desires, and my volition. Well, I have other faculties. Moreland describes this as a chest of drawers. You have a sock drawer, underwear drawer, t-shirt drawer. The soul has different faculties. Your mind, all these other aspects. And I would say one of those faculties is your fellowship and communion with God. And I would say that falls under the faculty of spirit. So I would say that the spirit is a faculty of my soul as opposed to something separate or distinct from my soul. Why is this important? Because I would say on a trichotomous view, you would essentially have to say that there are three things: a soul and a spirit, which are distinct in the sense that perhaps another substance, and then a body. And the problem with that, I'd say, is that if it is my spirit that is in communion with God, then that would have to be a part of my soul. I like to put it this way. I like to ask this trick question: What part of you taste? Is it your? Do you taste, or do your taste buds taste? Well, I would say the correct answer would be I taste by way of my taste buds, meaning I, as a whole, have a physical faculty of my taste buds that allows me to taste. So, in the same sense, we could say, is it me, the soul, or is it my spirit talking to God? Well, I would say I, as a soul, use my faculty of spirit to commune with God. But this is because I'd say that the spirit is a faculty of the soul. But if we're going to make these two separate or distinct substances, well, then if it is my spirit that has communion with God, then which one am I? Am I my spirit, or am I my soul? Well, if I'm the soul, well, who's that other guy? What's he doing here? And who's he talking to? But if it's a part of me, then I think that solves the problem as well. So that kind of just is a brief quick kind of way of unpacking that I would go to. Now, someone might say, but the Bible talks about soul and spirit. And I say, yes and amen. It also talks about the heart, the face, the countenance of a person, and sometimes this is what's called a synecdoche, if I'm pronouncing that right, which is a part to whole relationship. If I say all hands on deck, I'm not saying I want you to chop off your hand and throw it onto the deck, right? I want all of you, but I'm specifically focusing on your hands as a way to imply that I want you specifically for your labor. So I think sometimes when the Bible focuses on the heart or the soul or the spirit, it's typically trying to emphasize a certain aspect of you and not necessarily trying to say that it's a separate substance within you.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Beyond the biblical data, which seems to clearly talk about souls, human souls, for example, what would you say are some of your favorite, maybe one of your favorite arguments that the soul exists? And I know you already talked about this continuous identity and how if all of our physical parts every 7 to 10 years, let's say, is replaced, but I'm still Justin even from 8 years ago. So it seems to me that there's something required that's the same from 8 years ago to today that's not necessarily physical. I think you talked about that argument. If you want to unpack that one a little bit more, but do you have a favorite argument for the soul, maybe that doesn't rely on the biblical data?
So yeah, I don't know if I'd say I have a favorite, but to recap on the two you've touched on, we talked about conscious not being physical. And the natural question to that is that what possesses consciousness? Because if we know consciousness exists and it's not physical, then the question becomes, well, what is it that grounds consciousness? What possesses consciousness? And I know that I am conscious. And that word I, again, refers to something. Like if I say here or there, it's what you call an indexical word. So when I use the word I, what am I referring to? Am I referring to a body, a brain, or something more? And I would say the I refers to the soul. So I am a soul that grounds my and possesses my conscious states. And we talked about identity through change. There's quite a few others. There's some through free will, arguments from free will, arguments from what we would call the indivisibility of personhood. I might touch on that one. Arguments from the unity of consciousness, unified visual field. Um, so let's to touch on the, let's say, indivisibility of personhood. And all these have deeper implications to so many things. So what do we mean by that? Well, personhood, I am a person, and I possess what we can call the property of being a person. I possess personhood. So we
Mhm.
set up the syllogism in the same way. I am either a purely physical object, an aggregate, or an immaterial substance, a soul. Well, um, aggregates, purely physical objects, can come and exist in percentages or degrees. That you can have half a table, half a door, yada yada. Um, so if I am a purely physical object, then I should be able to exist in percentages or degrees. But I would say I cannot exist in percentages or degrees. I'm an all or nothing kind of thing. So to break this down, this goes down into the notion of a degreed property. Because if there's no soul, then I would say personhood is a degreed property. What does that mean? So philosophers distinguish between degreed and non-degreed properties. So a degreed property would be something like the property being hard or soft or loud or quiet. These are properties that can fluctuate or change. Something hard can be harder or softer. Something loud can be louder or quieter, and vice versa. So these are degreed properties. They can exist in percentages or degrees. Contrast that with non-degreed properties, like the property of being even. The number 2 and the number 6 are both numbers that possess the property of being even, but it makes no sense to say that the number 6 is, quote, more even than the number 2, because evenness is an all or nothing kind of thing. It either is or it isn't, and there is no in between. So, with this in mind, is personhood a degreed or non degreed property? Well, I would say that if it is a degreed property, then you get into these reductio ad absurdum, leads to absurd conclusions. So if there's no soul, then you're going to have to ground personhood in something physical like the brain and body. But the problem is that people fluctuate and change in the degrees of how much mass and matter they have. And if we attribute any intrinsic value to persons, then the question becomes, does having more mass and matter mean that you matter more? Men are typically larger than women, but would we say that men are more persons or more valuable than women? No, of course not. So there has to be something beyond the physical that transcends and grounds our personhood. And if it's going to be something physical, then that's going to fluctuate and change in degrees. But if personhood is like the property of being even, there's no fluctuation. It either is or isn't. There's no in between. Then again, you would have to have something transcending the physical, namely something like the soul. So again, if we took a table, cut it in half, it would make sense to say I have 50% of a table. But if I were to get my limb severed, well, it would make sense to say I have 50% of a body. It would not make sense to say that I am 50% of a person. I am 100% of a person with only 50% of a body. So right away, given Leibniz's law of identity, we see this distinction there. One cannot be identical or reducible to the other. Now, some will punt and say, okay, well, it's the brain that matters. Well, same problem. There have been operations where they've removed parts of a person's brain. So let's say a person only has 70% of a brain. Again, does that make them 70% persons, or are they full blown persons with just 70% functioning? Again, I can lose functioning, but I don't lose personhood. And so if personhood is non-degrade, and this goes even into implications of abortion, it doesn't matter how big the baby is. It doesn't matter what stage of development it is. No, because if personhood is non-degrade, then it's a baby from conception. It's a person from conception. And everything else is just a development of the capacities that it already has within the substance itself. So if personhood is non-degrade, then physicalism can't be true. You would need something like a soul to ground this.
Hey friends, I hope you're enjoying my talk with Eric Hernandez on the topic of the human soul. I want to let you know that this is the final episode of Season 1 of the Kingdom Way podcast. But rest assured that Season 2 is already in the works. I'll be bringing in some amazing Christian thinkers and scholars to talk about the doctrine of the Trinity, about growing in virtue, about the formation of the Bible, the various manuscripts, the different translations, and how each book ended up in the Bible, the doctrine of good works, and so much more. I'm really excited to share it with you. So we'll be back in a couple weeks with more content, more conversations, all with the goal to help us better imitate and follow in the steps of King Jesus, the pioneer of our faith. Right, that degreed point, particularly with abortion, that reminds me of Scott Klusendorf's sled argument.
That's right.
Now, what if someone were to say, well, okay, personhood is not degreed, but my identity as Justin or Eric is tied to my memories. You know, I knock my head and I lose 90% of my memories. And then what if someone just bites the bullet and says, okay, that person then does lose 90% of their identity? How would you respond to someone who really grounds things in memories?
Yeah, so that's another option for both of the arguments I use, whether it's identity change or personhood. And I would say it goes into the same problem. So first, I would say that if we're talking about identity change, then no, the person wouldn't lose 10% of their personhood. They would literally become different persons. Because as I mentioned in the first argument, for aggregates, they don't retain identity change or part replacement. So you would have to say, in a real sense, a new Justin is coming into existence every so many seconds or minutes. Every time you either lose or gain new memories or whatnot, you're going to become a different person. But or some will say, no, it's the whole collection of a person's life is what makes them who they are. But then that also gets into problems, because then you're not, quote unquote, fully a person at one stage, or you're a different person. Think of it like a baseball game. A baseball game has 9 innings. The whole of the baseball game is not in the first inning or second. It's the entire 9 innings. But then that would, again, assume that you're not, quote unquote, a full person at one stage, or that you're just a collection of time slices, which, again, I would say goes into a lot of reductio ad absurdum, lead to absurd kind of conclusions. So, for example, is my wife married to the same guy she married, 8 years ago? Well, on that view, no. She's literally married to a new person each time. So really, the marriage certificate is invalid because it's not the same person. I was talking to someone who wanted to push this idea, and I asked the following question. I say, if a guy, let's say, is married for 10 years, happily married, faithful to his wife, they have 5 kids, gets in a car wreck, loses his memory. Is his wife now single? And this person said yes. I said, oh, okay, biting the bullet. Okay. Now let's suppose, so they're both single now. But let's suppose after a few months of therapy, he regains all his memories back. Is it the same person? And this person said, yeah, it's the same person again. Okay, so you're telling me a guy can begin to exist, cease to exist, and begin to exist again? There seems to be something off about the notion of something beginning to exist twice, if you will. But then again, you're leading to this absurd conclusion that, well, now you have someone who existed, ceased to exist, his wife's single, but then now she's married again because he came back into existence. So yeah, it again leads into all these absurd, counterintuitive type of conclusions. And people who want to bite the bullet on that, well, then they're going to have to apply that in real life. Is someone held accountable for a murder they committed, 10 years ago? Is this person with 5 kids now single because it's not the same person? Am I literally a new person every time I get a new memory or lose old memories? It goes into a whole bunch of absurdities, if you will.
This reminds me a lot of, I don't know if you've seen a lot of the recent Marvel movies with multiverse, and they're not always the most consistent, but I think they dip their toes into some of these questions of identity and
Hmm.
meeting
That's right.
meeting yourself from another universe, and is it the same person, and fascinating discussions. But yeah, usually they're not the most consistent
Mm,
philosophically. Now, our audience
yeah.
may not be familiar that there is this movement within Christianity called Christian physicalism. I wonder if you could briefly, I know this is a whole area to explore, talk about what is Christian physicalism, because at first glance that just sounds almost crazy. And I know there's respected Christians who hold to this view. So, what is a Christian physicalist, and how does it relate to the soul? How do they view the soul compared to, say, someone who's a substance dualist?
Yeah, it's going to depend on the Christian physicalists you talk to. Some of the more popular ones are Nancy Murphy, another professor, Newton Maloney, H. Newton Maloney, if I'm pronouncing his name right, and they argue that that if they use the word soul, they're using it in a kind of like a replacement theory, where it, in fact, I have a quote here, is that the soul is a functional capacity of a complex organism rather than a separate spiritual essence that somehow inhabits the body. So they would essentially, again, depending on which ones you talk to, they would be physicalists in that there is nothing immaterial. Um, and again, it's going to vary from person to person, but let's go with that version where there is no soul. It's just all physical. It's all neurology. It's all brain and body kind of stuff. I think that gets into a lot of problems theologically and biblically speaking, because of course they make an exception for God, which kind of seems to be special pleading. And well, then what does it mean to be made in the image of God? And without going there, I think there's profound implications there. But when you look at the biblical data, I don't see. I mean, I guess I get how they could come to that conclusion, but I I think they have to jump through some hoops and loops and kind of really reinterpret some things that are, in my opinion, very clear. So even just looking at it from the beginning, suffice to say that in Scripture there are a lot of positions that are presupposed and defended as opposed to presented, so to speak. In other words, you're not going to find the correspondence theory of truth in Scripture. You're just going to find it assumed. The truth is that which corresponds to reality. Because, mind you, the Bible isn't a book of philosophy or even, I dare say, theology, even though we get our philosophy and theology a lot from it. It's not its intent, so to speak. It's not intended to be a college level textbook on these things. So we have to gather biblical data. What would have the authors believe? What were they implying? What were they arguing? And go just to Genesis in the beginning, where God creates Adam's body, then puts what's called the breath of life. So automatically you see something physical into play, and then something that's called the breath of life. So there already seems to be two things at play here. You look at in the Old Testament, talks about the dead in Sheol, which implies a type of afterlife. Talks about Abraham's bosom, which seems to be this idea of continued life after death, where you're disembodied but you still exist in some type of a paradise. Um, then Jesus talking to the thief on the cross says, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Mount of Transfiguration, you see Moses and Elijah show up, and yet Moses and Elijah have been dead for a long time. So, and yet they're still existing somehow, some way. They're conscious. In the Old Testament, God prohibits necromancy, which is a practice of talking to the dead. Why would you prohibit talking to the dead unless, in some sense, maybe you could talk to the dead, or at least there was this belief? You see the witch of Endor calling up Samuel from the dead. So you see all these ideas of there being an afterlife, because, and I mentioned this because a Christian physicalist is going to have to do something with what we would call the intermediate state of existence. And this is where it gets interesting and into a lot of Pauline theology and Pharisaic theology, really. Um, so when you look at Pharisaic belief in contrast to the Sadducees, I would say the Sadducees were, in a real sense, Christian physicalists. They didn't believe in an afterlife. They didn't believe in angels, demons. They didn't believe in the intermediate state. They didn't believe in the soul. They didn't have those beliefs, whereas the Pharisees did. And you note that a lot of times they clash together. And so, for example, well, first focusing on the Pharisees, um, John W. Cooper has a book called Body, Soul, and Life Everlasting. And he argues that for the Pharisees, there was a two-part or two-stage eschatology that went hand in hand for the Pharisees. The first was an intermediate state. What is that? It's if you and I were to die right now, we would exist disembodied and we would be awaiting our the final resurrection, where we would get our glorified bodies. So Paul talks about this as being a state of nakedness. Um, he talks about this being an earthly tent, and he says some interesting stuff in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, 1 through 10. Says, as long as we live here on earth, we are absent from the Lord. And he also says, and he would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So you see this distinction. And he also makes this distinction between I and me versus the body and the flesh. So he's making a distinction between I, the self, and the body or flesh that he resides in. So automatically you have this presupposition of at least two things at play: the I, the inner man, and the body. So now let's talk about this idea of the the intermediate state awaiting the final resurrection. Again, this is all throughout Pauline theology, where he even says, so consider the fact that he's on trial, right? The Sadducees and Pharisees are trying to get him accused of something. And when he notices that these are Sadducees and Pharisees teaming up against him, he does a really smart move, knowing that they disagree about intermediate state and resurrection. And he says, guys, why am I on trial if not for the resurrection of the dead? And when the Pharisees heard that, they perked up and said, hey, wait a minute, that's right. Yeah, he is on trial because of the resurrection. And then note what they say in defense. They say, what if a spirit or an angel came and spoke to him? What they are implying is not necessarily resurrection. They're implying intermediate state. In other words, what if someone who died, a disembodied soul, came and spoke to him and revealed to him something? So in defense of resurrection, they appealed to the intermediate state because the Sadducees disagreed with both. But again, for them, these two went hand in hand. So if, for them, affirming resurrection also was an affirmation of the intermediate state. And this is why when he says, I'm on trial for the resurrection of the dead, they go to intermediate state. What if a spirit came and spoke to him? And of course, Sadducees and Pharisees start arguing with each other, and Paul just kind of slips out the back door. His job was done. Same thing with Jesus and the Pharisees. The Pharisees disagree with resurrection, and they come to Jesus, and they try to give a reductio ad absurdum. If this woman gets married, her husband dies, she has to marry the brother, and this happens 7 times. In heaven, whose wife will she be? Suffice to say that what he ends up doing, because I love to talk about this passage, but that'll take a much longer time. What he does is he quotes from Exodus 3:6, because they would not have regarded anything other than the Torah as credible, as God's, as we would maybe put it, inspired, inerrant, infallible word. For them, it was only the Torah, nothing else. So he avoids quoting from Daniel or Isaiah, and he just quotes Exodus. And something odd happens here, because the argument is about resurrection. But he quotes Exodus 3:6, which says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, that verse has nothing to do with resurrection. But again, he's quoting it, one, because they would have believed that, and it was from Torah, and that was also their favorite verse to quote, which makes it hilarious when he starts that response by saying, have you not read? It was their favorite verse to quote. Of course they read it. Now he says, have you not read what God has said to you? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then he adds to the verse by saying, and he is the God of the living, not the God of the dead. And the next verse says that the crowd's minds were blown. Why? What happened? His argument is essentially this. On your view, if there's no afterlife, then Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are dead. They don't exist anymore. And yet your favorite verse says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not I was the God, I am the God. And if he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, well, is he not the God of the living, not the dead? And yet if you're right, they're dead. And how can he be their God if he's the God of the living? Which means if he is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, then it must follow that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are still alive and well, though not physically present on this earth. So he's appealing to an intermediate state of existence in order to back up his belief in resurrection by quoting one of their verses and making that argument. So I would say you see all through Scripture, there is this belief of the person being an immaterial self, a soul that has a body, and then this is especially exemplified in the intermediate state, where again, Paul talks about being in a state of nakedness, where I have an earthly tent, but then he talks about this earthly tent being destroyed and then being found in a state of nakedness without a body, but awaiting the final resurrection where we'll put on a glorified heavenly body.
I love seeing Jesus and Paul interact with these different individuals and groups and theological positions. And like you mentioned with Paul, kind of dropping that hand grenade there, then just slipping out the back door. They're amusing scenes to think about, but it shows how clever these, early followers of Jesus were, and Jesus himself, of course, in interacting with these different perspectives.
That's right. Yeah. And so he even talks about, he says, to live in the body here on earth, Well, for him was to be in the body was to live here, but then to depart was to be with Christ. And again, that goes back to this idea that, he says, as long as we're here on earth, we're absent from the Lord. And then he even talks about at one point, there's a man caught up into the third heaven, and he says something specific, whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that say that he was out of the body? No, but what it's saying is he believed that it was
Right.
possible to exist disembodied, because again, as a Pharisee, this went hand in hand. So when you look at the beliefs of Jesus, of Paul, and the Sadducees, you look at who Paul sides with, look at who Jesus sides with, and look at the implications behind their responses. It shows us what they would have believed about the afterlife, the death, resurrection, and intermediate state of a person.
Yeah, that's a passage I was gonna bring up where Paul mentions whether outside the body or in the body, which is a fascinating passage. He makes this sort of parenthetical comment about this experience that this other person has, and I wish he would have written more about that.
It's funny you say that, and that kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier. Why didn't he write more on that? Well, because it was just
Mm-hmm.
common knowledge to them. That's what they would have believed. There was no need to expound on that. So when people say, "Oh, the Bible doesn't teach, dualism or soul," well, that's why I say it presupposes and then defends it, because to the audience he's writing to, there would have been no need to that unless you're engaging with the Sadducees, and this is what you see Jesus do. This is what you see Paul do. So by looking at these, as you mentioned, these off the cuff remarks that he's making, that just kind of throwaway remarks, they're really going to give us a lot of deep, rich insight into their belief about those kind of things.
I have a couple more questions for you here, Eric. One is, and I think this gets into discussions of gender, sexuality, and so much of the contemporary conversations around transgenderism. And my question is, are souls gendered? And is that just a category error to ask if souls have this feature to them? Would it be better to say they're properly matched to a specific body, a sex body? And I know this gets into discussions too about if gender and sex are synonymous, because traditionally they've been seen as synonymous terms. But in more contemporary conversations, there's a distinction made between what you might call biological sex with the XY chromosome and XX, and then gender, which is more of a psychological, subjective experience you have of being a man or woman. So I know there's a lot to get through here. We could do a whole podcast on just that discussion, but specifically as it relates to the soul.
Yeah, it's a great question. This is where it gets a little bit more technical philosophically. Short answer, yes, I would say souls are gendered for a few reasons. As Moreland puts it, the body is an external realization of an internal structure. So, on my view of substance dualism, this also gets into some more technical terminology of things like what's called the Traducian view of the soul and what's called organicism. Suffice to say that this means that on the organicist view, it's your soul that is kind of what forms a body. And on the Traducian view, your soul is, and I'm going to very much oversimplify. You get your soul in part from. It has connections to your mother and father. So when the sperm and egg meet, there is soulish, what you call soulish totipotentiality. What does that mean? That while these aren't themselves substances, when they come together, there's substantial change, and a new substance comes into existence, namely a soul. And this is where you're going to get some of those characteristics. So remember I said earlier, the body and soul are deeply, deeply intertwined. And the reason to unpack this a little bit further, so the two major views on when the soul originates, if you will, is the Traducian view of the soul and the creationist view. And again, oversimplifying here, Traducian view that in part you get your soul, characteristics of your soul from your mom and dad, when the sperm and egg meet. And then on the creationist view, God, quote unquote, puts a soul into something when the right physical conditions are met. So if you look in Genesis, I talked to Moreland over the phone once, and he says that this is, in a sense, an argument against pagans. It's an apologetic, but not in the way we think against, atheists or whatnot, but against pagans, because in the pagan mentality, if you want your crops to be fertile, you have to engage in these, ritual orgies, if you will, in order to appease the gods and make the crops grow. Whereas in Genesis, it says, no, God made everything to reproduce after its kind, whose seed is in itself. So there seems to be this idea against the pagans that God has already set the system up and put it in place that all you have to do is take what's already there and put them together, and whose seed is in itself is going to reproduce after its kind. So that is, in a sense, could be an argument for the Traducian view. God has set up the system that new souls can come into being with what we already have here, so to speak. And God doesn't have to, quote unquote, create a soul ex nihilo and just kind of put into a body. So on the Traducian view and the organicist view, the soul, if I can use the big words here, is ontologically prior to its parts as a whole. What does that mean? Going back to aggregates and substances. If I were to take a tire off of a car, the tire maintains its existence and identity as a tire even when it's not connected to the car. What that tells us is that for aggregates, their parts exist before the whole, meaning I can have all the parts of a car laid out on a mat, and they still are what they are, even though they're not put together in the form of a car. So for aggregates, parts exist before the wholes. For substances, it's the other way around. A quick and easy example, when a puppy is born, its eyes aren't fully developed, its ears aren't fully developed, but it's a whole dog. So the dog as a whole exists prior to even its parts being fully developed and actualized. So on top of that, if, again, you take a tire from a car, it remains a car. But if you sever my arm from my body, it will lose its identity as a human arm, which is evident by the fact that within a few days it would decay and cease to exist. So for substances, the parts depend on the whole, and the whole is prior to the parts. For aggregates, the parts depend on the whole and is prior to the whole. So with this in mind, on my view, if there is a body present, it already assumes the soul must be there to begin with, because again, the soul is ontologically prior to the parts. Now note, I'm saying ontologically, not chronologically. I'm not trying to imply that the soul somehow exists in heaven before in the body. That is not what I'm saying, to be clear. Ontologically is a technical term that just means even if they both exist at the same time, the soul is what is prior, because the parts depend on the soul on that whole. So that being said, if the body is an external realization of what my soul is, then it would make sense that, humans have bodies different than dogs, because a human soul requires certain capacities and a dog soul has different capacities, and those each require a different type of body to actualize those potentialities or capacities they have. So I have eyes and ears because my soul has a capacity for sight and hearing sound, so it needs to develop a body that can actualize those capacities while I'm here in body. So all that to say is, we could put it this way. If I put a blanket over a chair, while I may not be able to see the chair, I can see the form that the blanket takes, and that's going to give me an idea of what's underneath that blanket. In a similar fashion, I would argue, by looking at my body, it gives me an idea of what kind of soul I have. So, I have eyes, I have ears, I have XYZ. That shows me that I must have a certain kind of soul that has those capacities. Same line of thought, I would say the same would apply to being gendered. Depending on what I have physically, that's going to express what I am internally.
I think, and I'm sure you'd agree with this as well, that in these discussions, whether you're on the right or the left, whatever perspective you take, when we're talking about the transgender issue, I think a lot of these philosophical issues need to be unpacked and explored. People rush so quickly to the superficial elements to the discussion and don't really unpack the philosophical foundations.
Absolutely.
Whatever side you take, these conversations about Traducianism, which you've mentioned, the structure of the soul, how it relates to the body, all these things are so important to talk about. And I wish, especially Christians, would really wrestle with these discussions a little bit more before jumping into maybe some of the more political elements of these topics.
Yeah, and these have implications. Like when talking to naturalists, if naturalists are agree with like gender dysphoria, and they may say that the person is something different than their body. But note that a naturalist can't really do that, because they're automatically assuming some type of dualism. They're automatically assuming that a person is not identical or visible to their body. So while I would definitely disagree with the transgender issues, the implications there, I would disagree with that. The implications there are that you're assuming a dualist type of worldview. Another question becomes, well, which worldview best explains even the possibility to grant what you're looking for? And you're not going to get that on a naturalist worldview. So I would say the implications are more in favor of theism. Again, to be clear to the audience, I'm not saying I agree with the transgender discussion and what they're trying to say. What I'm saying is they're conceding ground that is in favor of our view and not theirs.
Next time, if you're able to come on, I'd love to talk about your book, and then maybe we can get into a little bit more of this discussion of near-death experiences as an argument for God and maybe the soul as well. But really appreciate you coming on and talking about what the soul is and why I think we have one. So thanks again.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I enjoyed it.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of The Kingdom Way. If you found the conversation helpful in your walk with Jesus, please consider giving the show a review on your listening platform. Thanks, and we'll see you next time.